So I was driving along, minding my own business, just enjoying my donut. Man, it was good. Bavarian cream-filled Long Johns are just the best. When out of the blue, I heard a loud clacking noise from underneath my Sport Trac. I rolled my window down and the noise got louder. It sounded like a CV axle and the driver front axle shaft was failing. I put the Sport Trac in the four-wheel drive and the clacking increased. Bummed out, I headed home and pulled the Sport Trac into the garage. First step, as always, is to raise the Sport Trac up. This can be done with jack stands or ramps, as I am using here. I crawled underneath the front end to look at the front axle shafts. None of the CV boots looked damaged or torn. Neither front shaft had excessive play. I moved further back towards the transfer case. I looked at the front driveshaft CV joint and saw the boot was torn. And wouldn't you know it, there was excessive play in the joint. Since the Sport Tracs have an independent front suspension, the front drive shaft should have next to no play at all. There are two options at this point: replace the entire drive shaft or rebuild the CV joint. I'm a cheapie, so I'm going to rebuild the CV joint. There are a few tools that are needed for this job: a 1/4-inch ratchet, a 6mm deep socket, a T30 Torx bit, a 4mm hex bit with an extension, something for marking, a pocket screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, pliers, snap ring pliers, diagonal cutters, a brass hammer, a knife, an impact with a 10mm socket, and a pry bar. Next, remove the skid plate that protects the transfer case. This gives us a better access to the CV joint bolts. Mark the drive shaft and the U-joint caps before removing the bolts. Incorrect U-joint orientation on the install can lead to vibrations at speed and premature failure. Use the 1/4-inch ratchet and the T30 Torx bit to remove the U-joint bolts and the straps. Use the 6mm deep socket to remove the bolts for the CV joint at the transfer case. Keep track of the straps for the CV joint. You'll need those for later. The drive shaft needs to be compressed to remove it from the Sport Trac. Since this is a solid front drive shaft, all of our compression has to come from the CV joint on the transfer case. Because this CV joint is old and stiff, a pry bar is useful in persuading the joint to budge. Pry on the center of the U-joint. Be wary of the U-joint caps when prying. At this point, it is a good idea to tape the caps of the U-joint in place. Once the U-joint has cleared the front differential, the drive shaft will just fall out. The rebuild kit I got comes with all the parts seen here. There is a replacement boot and clamp, a replacement cap and gasket, new CV joint bolts, a tube of grease, a new snap ring, and a completely new CV joint. Put the drive shaft in a vise with the CV joint facing up. Use a screwdriver to pry the old cap off of the joint. Oh wow, I was not expecting that much rust and gunked grease to be inside this thing. Dang. There is barely any movement out of this joint, and what movement there is requires a lot of force. While this rust does look bad, it seems mostly superficial. A quick tap of the brass hammer and the snap ring rust breaks loose. Use the snap ring pliers to open the snap ring. Use a flathead screwdriver to work the ring off over the shaft. It is a good idea to keep a finger on the snap ring to keep it flying off into oblivion. A quick spray of WD-40 will help the joint slide off the splines. Use the flathead screwdriver and the hammer to work the boot cap off of the joint. Then pry open the boot clamp and cut it off with diagonal pliers. Use the knife to cut off the remaining boot. Use the brass hammer to massage the old joint off of the splines. The brass hammer is highly suggested because it will not cause damage to the steel splines or the joint. If only the boot was being replaced, the joint would need to be undamaged. I believe the reason this joint failed is very simple. At some point in the past, the rubber boot tore around the shaft. This exposed the joint to the elements. Living in Nebraska, that means salt in the winter. Combine that with my trip to Tuttle Creek last April, it was only a matter of time before rust won the battle. Use a rag or a towel to clean any gunk left on the shaft and the splines. A wire brush can be used to get in between the splines if needed. This is also a good time to inspect the splines and shaft for damage. Time for some new parts. Start with the CV boot. Put the clamp on first. It is very hard to put the clamp on after the boot. As you can see, the boot does not want to fit on the shaft easily. Grab your handy pocket screwdriver and put it through the boot. Use the screwdriver to work the boot over the shaft. Once the boot takes, pull out the screwdriver. Work the boot down until the edge sits into the groove. Then put the clamp over the boot edge and tighten it down. Pliers make gripping the clamp a breeze. Loop and fold the end of the clamp. A few taps with the hammer keeps things in place. Finally, collapse the boot down onto itself. Before installing the new CV joint to the splines, make sure the grooved face is facing up and the smooth face is facing down towards the boot. The grooved face is for the cap to sit properly. One more thing before installing the joint. You gotta make things a little bit messy. Use the supplied grease to fill the grooves where the ball bearings run. This is important as no grease will cause the joint to heat up and destroy itself. Then we will be back to doing this all over again. Cram as much of the grease as possible into the joint. The rest of the grease can go into the boot and the cap. Use a bolt to line up the new CV joint to the boot. Line the splines up and slide the joint on. If the joint does not go on easy, make sure the splines are cleaned and lined up. Install the new snap ring. If the groove is not visible, use the brass hammer to gently seat the CV joint down below the groove. Install the cap gasket and the cap, lining the divots up with the holes. The new joint should have ease of movement with no extra play. Slide the drive shaft back into the Sport Trac, CV joint first. Line up the CV joint holes to the transfer case and reinstall the bolts. Make sure to include the bolt straps. Line the U-joint back with the marks made earlier. Install the U-joint caps and the bolts. Finally, reinstall the skid plate. Take a victory lap test drive to make sure the noise is no longer present. Upon first viewing of the test drive footage, I was worried something wasn't installed correctly. The CV joint was moving laterally, like it wasn't seated in the transfer case firmly. I looked closer at the footage and saw that the lateral movement only happened when the entire engine and transmission assembly was moving. Now it makes more sense for the Sport Trac to have a CV joint instead of a U-joint. Two U-joints would require a slip joint in the drive shaft itself. A CV joint allows for a solid drive shaft and takes up the movement into the joint itself.